Welcome back to your next chapter in the history of Protestantism by James A. Wiley. I'm Nicholas Arthur, and you are listening to Prophecy Reformation Now. Because God-given prophecy is history in advance, it is very important for the Christian to learn about the history of the church that Jesus said he would build, starting about 2,000 years ago when he said, "I will build my church." Only if we truly understand history can we find our place in the prophecy of the Revelation, and perhaps even come to know what must shortly come to pass in our own time as well. So, let us pick up right where we left off last time. We are compelled to ask when we see the courageous man shut up in the Coburg and the timid and trembling one sent into the field, was this the best arrangement? Was the right man in the right place? The arrangement we would have made would have been exactly the reverse. We would have sent the strong man to fight the battle, and withdrawn the weak and feeble one into the retreat of the Coburg, there to commune and pray. But in this, as in other instances, we are taught that God's ways are not our ways, nor his thoughts as our thoughts. The actual arrangement was best. It was the strong man that was needed to pray. It was the weak one that was fitted to receive and act upon the answer. It is only the prayer of faith that prevails, and it is only to a great faith that great blessings are given. Melanchthon, therefore, would have been out of place in the Coburg, but his weaknesses in the field illustrated the power of his master and showed who was doing the work. Beside the lengths he was willing to go to meet the papists, and he went much further than Luther would have done, only the more manifestly put Rome in the wrong, and left the blame of the final rupture with her. But if Luther with uplifted hands drew down daily strength from the skies, as the conductor draws down the electric fire from the clouds, it was to send on the divine influence, which descended from above, to those who had so much need of it at Augsburg. Faith begets faith, and Luther became as God to Melanchthon and the men around him. Let us enter the Coburg. The voice, as of a man in a great agony, falls on our ear. He groans, he cries yet more earnestly. Whose voice is it? Listen. It is Luther's. We need not enter his chamber. We can distinctly hear every word where we stand outside his closet door in the corridor. I have once heard him praying, wrote Viet Dietrich, a friend who at times visited the reformer in the castle, communicating with God as a father and friend, and reminding him of his own promises from the Psalms, which he was certain would be made good. I know, O God, thou art our dear God and Father. Therefore I am certain that thou wilt destroy the persecutors of thy church. If thou dost not destroy them, thou art in like danger with us. It is thine own cause. The enemies of the cross of Christ assault us. It appertains to thee, and the honor of thy name to protect thy confessors at Augsburg. Thou hast promised, thou wilt do it, for thou hast done it from the beginning. Let thine help shine forth in this extremity. The prayer has gone up. It has knocked at the gates of the eternal temple. It has unlocked the fountains of God's power, and now an air celestial fills the chambers of the Coburg, and a divine strength is infused into the soul of its inmate. What Luther has freely received, he freely gives to others. He sends it onward to Augsburg. Thus, what is the meaning, writes he to Melanchthon, of fearing, trembling, caring, and sorrowing? Will he not be with us in this world's trifles, who has given us his own Son? In private troubles I am weak, and ye are strong. If at least I can call private the conflicts I have with Satan. But in public trials I am what you are in private. The cause is just and true. It is Christ's cause. miserable saintling that I am. I may well turn pale and tremble for myself, but I can never fear for the cause. I pray, have prayed, and shall pray for thee, Philip, he wrote in another letter. And I have felt the Amen in my heart. Our Lord Jesus Christ, he wrote to Jonas, is King of kings and Lord of lords. If he disowned the title at Augsburg, he must disown it in heaven and earth. Amen. So the battle proceeded on the two sides, wiles, frowns, threats, with the sword as the last resort, are seen on the one side, prayers, tears, and faith on the other. The Emperor Charles, the legate Campeggio, and the popish theologians at Augsburg saw only Melanchthon. They beheld him dejected, bending under a load of anxieties, and coming to them each day with a new concession or explanation, if happily it might end the battle. The adversary with whom they were all the while contending, however, was one they saw not, one who was out of their reach. The man of prayer in the Coburg, or rather, the God-man at the right hand of power in heaven, the Ancient of Days. We have seen the emperor send away 2 commissions with instructions to each to deliberate on the matter referred to and return on a future day with the answer. They are here in the presence of the emperor to give in their report. First come the representatives of the 14 cities which had refused adherence to the Edict of Spires, 1529. Of these cities, some were of Zwingli's sentiments on the sacrament, while others agreed with the Augsburg Confession. This difference of opinion had introduced the wedge of discord, and had raised the hopes of the emperor nevertheless, in the presence of the common foe. They were united and firm. They replied to Charles that they were not less desirous than their ancestors had been to testify all loyal and obedience to his imperial majesty, but that they could not adhere to the recess of Spires without disobeying God and compromising the salvation of their souls. Thus the hope vanished which the emperor had cherished of detaching the cities from the princes and so weakening the Protestant front. The next body to appear at the foot of the emperor's throne, with an account of their labors, were the 20 theologians to whom had been entrusted the important matter of preparing an answer to the Protestant confession. They had gone to work with a will, meeting twice a day, and we can do justice to their zeal only when we reflect that it was now on the eve of the dog days. Eck and his company showed themselves experts at producing what they understood to be wanted, a condemnation rather than a refutation. Eck had declared beforehand that the latter could not be forthcoming if Scripture were allowed a hearing. This very considerably simplified and lightened the task, and in a fortnight Eck and his coadjutors gave in a document of not less than 280 pages. In point of bulk, this performance might have suffered to refute not one, but a dozen such confessions as that of Augsburg. Charles surveyed the ponderous refutation with dismay. He appeared to divine that it would only fortify that which it was meant to overthrow, and overthrow that which it was intended to fortify. It did not improve on closer acquaintance. It was vapid as well as bulky. It was pointless as a refutation, and vigorous only in its abuse. Its call for blood was unmistakable. Charles saw that it would never do to give the world an opportunity of contrasting the lumbering periods and sanguinary logic of Eck with the terse and perspicuous style and lofty sentiments of Melanchthon. Her worst foe could not do Rome a more unkindly act, or Wittenberg a greater service, than to publish such a document. Another refutation must be prepared, yet even this inspired but little hope, for to whom could the emperor commit the task, except to the old hands? Letters, too, alas, were going over to the side of Wittenberg, and soon nothing would remain with Rome but one thing, the sword. But the Reformation was not yet able to endure persecution, and meanwhile the friends of the gospel were placed one after another near Charles, to pluck away his hand when it was laid on his sword's hilt, with intent to unsheath and use it against the gospel. He had buried Gattinara, the friend of toleration, at Innsbruck. This left the legate Campeggio without a rival in the imperial councils. But only 3 days after the reading of the Confession, 2 ladies of high rank came to Augsburg, whose quiet but powerful influence restored the balance broken by the death of Gattinara. The one was Mary, the sister of the emperor, and widow of Louis, King of Hungary. The other was her sister-in-law, the Queen of Bohemia, and wife of Ferdinand of Austria. The study of the Scriptures had opened to both the way of peace. Their hearts had been won for the gospel, and when Campeggio approached to instill his evil counsel into the ear of the emperor, these 2 ladies were able, by a word fitly spoken, to neutralize its effects upon the mind of their brother, and draw him back from the paths of violence to which, at the instigation of the legate, he seemed about to commit himself. In those days truth could sometimes be spoken to princes in a figure when it dare not be told them in plain language. One day during his stay in Augsburg, as Charles sat at dinner with his lords, a message was brought to him that some comedians wished to amuse him and his guests. Instant permission was given, for the request was in accordance with the manners of the age, and excited no suspicion. First an old man in a doctor's gown tottered across the floor, carrying a burden of sticks, some long, some short. Throwing down the sticks on the hearth in confusion, he turned to retire. On his back now, displayed to the courtiers, was the name John Reuchlin. A second mask now entered, also attired as a doctor. He went up to the hearth, began deftly arranging the sticks. He worked assiduously for a little while, but, despite his pains, the long and short, the crooked and the straight, would not pair. So, giving up the task, with a sardonic smile on his countenance, he made his exit. Charles and his lords, as he walked out, read on his back, Erasmus of Rotterdam. The comedy was beginning to have interest. A third now entered. This time it was a monk, in the frock and cowl of the Augustines. With keen eye and firm step he crossed the hall, bearing a brazier filled with live coals. He raked the sticks together, not waiting to sort them, but put a coal underneath the heap, blew it up, and soon a blazing fire was roaring on the hearth. As he withdrew, he showed on his back Martin Luther. The plot was thickening. A fourth appeared, a stately personage covered with the insignia of empire. He gazes with displeasure at the fire. He draws a sword and plunges it in amongst the burning faggots. The more they are stirred, the more fiercely they blaze. He strikes again and again. The flames mount higher, and the red sparks fall thicker around. It is plain that he is feeding, not quenching the fire. The mask turns round and strides across the hall in great anger. He has no name, nor is it necessary. Every one divines it, though no one utters it. Yet another, a fifth. He comes forward with solemn and portly air. His robes, which are great magnificence, are priestly. He wears a triple crown on his head, and the keys of St. Peter are suspended from his girdle. On seeing the fire, this great personage is seized with sudden anguish, and wrings his hands. He looks around for something with which to extinguish it. He espies at the farther end of the hall 2 vessels, one containing water, and the other oil. He rushes eagerly to get hold of the one containing water. In his hurry, he clutches the wrong vessel, one filled with oil. and empties it on the fire. The fire blazes up with a fury that singes his priestly robe, and compels its unfortunate wearer to escape for his safety. The comedy is at an end. The authors of this play never came forward to receive the praise due to their ingenuity, or to claim the pecuniary reward usually forthcoming on such occasions. They doubtless held it would be reward enough if the emperor profited by its moral. "Let thy gifts be to thyself," said the prophet, when he read the writing on the wall of the king's palace. So said the men who now interpreted in the Palatinate Palace of Augsburg the fate of the empire and the papacy. Chapter 26. End of the Diet of Augsburg. Diplomacy. The Protestant princes. John the Steadfast. Bribes and threatening. Second refutation of the Confession. Submission demanded from the Protestants. They refuse. Luther's faith. Romanists resume negotiations. Melanchthon's concessions. Melanchthon's fall. All hopes of reconciliation abandoned. Recess of the Diet. Mortification and defeat of the emperor. Charles V laughed at the humor of the comedy, but did not ponder the wisdom of its moral. He went on poking amongst the red faggots, first with diplomacy and next with the sword, but with no other result than that which the nameless authors of the piece acted in the palace of the Palatinate had warned him would ensue, that of kindling a fire on the wide hearth of Europe, which would in the end not merely singe the hem of the pontifical robe and the fringe of the imperial mantle, but would consume the body of both empire and papacy. The emperor had endeavored to introduce the thin end of the wedge, which he hoped would split up the Protestant free cities, an attempt, however, which came to nothing. The Lutheran princes were to be next essayed. They were taken one by one, in the hope that they would be found less firm when single than they were when taken together. Great offers, loftier titles, larger territories, more consideration, were made to them, would they but return to the church. When bribes failed to seduce them, threats were had recourse to. They were given to understand that, stripped of title and territory, they would be turned adrift upon the world as poor as the meanest of their subjects. They were reminded that their religion was a new one, that their adherence to it branded all their ancestors as heretics, that they were a minority in the empire, and that it was madness in them to defy the power and provoke the ire of the emperor. Neither were threats able to bend them to submission. They had come to the Diet of 1526 with the words written upon their shields, Verbum Domini manet in aeternum. The word of the Lord endureth forever, and, steadfast to their motto, their faith taught them not to fear the wrath of the powerful Charles. No efforts were spared to compel the Elector John to bow the neck. If he should yield, the strength of the confederacy would be broken, so it was thought, and the emperor would make short work of the theologians. Why the latter should be so obstinate the emperor could not imagine, unless it were that they stood behind the broad shield of the Elector. Charles sent for John, and endeavored to shake him by promises. When it was found that these could not detach him from the Protestant confession, the emperor strove to terrify him by threats. He would take from him his electoral hat. He would chase him from his dominions. He would let loose against him the whole power of the empire, and crush him as a potsherd. John saw himself standing on the brink of an abyss. He must make his choice between his crown and his Savior. Melanchthon and all the divines conjured the Elector not to think of them. They were ready that moment to endure any manner of death the emperor might decree against them, if that would appease his wrath. The elector refused to profit by this magnanimous purpose of self-devotion. He replied with equal magnanimity to the theologians that he also must confess his Lord. He went back to the emperor and calmly announced his resolution by saying that he had to crave of his majesty that he would permit him and his to render an account to God in those matters that concerned the salvation of their souls. John risked all, but in the end he retained all, and amply vindicated his title to the epithet given him, John the Constant. After 6 weeks, the trio, Faber, Eck, and Cochleus, produced, with much hard labor and strain of mind, another refutation of the Confession, or rather the former remodeled and abbreviated. Charles could show no less honor to the work of his doctors than had been shown to the Confession of Melanchthon. On the 3rd of September he sat down upon his throne, and calling his princes round him, commanded the refutation to be read in their presence. In those doctrines which are common to both creeds, such as the Trinity and the divinity of Christ, the refutation agreed with the confession. It also made an admission which would, but for the statement that followed, and which largely neutralized it, have been a most important one, namely, that faith is necessary in the sacrament, but it went on to affirm that man is born with the power of performing good works, and that those works cooperate with faith in the justification of the sinner, thus rearing again the old fabric of salvation by works, which the former admission respecting the necessity of faith appearing to have thrown down. On another vital point, the refutation and the confession were found to be in direct and fatal antagonism. Eck and his colleagues maintained the divine authority of the hierarchy, and, of course, the correlative duty of absolute submission to it. The Protestants acknowledged no infallible rule on earth but the Scriptures. The two churches, after very laborious effort on both sides, had come as near to each other as it appeared possible to come, but neither could conceal from itself the fact that there was still a gulf between them, an impassable gulf, for neither could pass to the other without ceasing to be what it had hitherto been. Should the papacy pass over, it left 10 centuries behind it. The moment it touched the Wittenberg shore, it threw off its allegiance to councils and traditions, and became the subject of another power. Should Protestantism pass over, it left the Bible behind it, and submitting to the old yoke of the 7 hills, confessed that the Wittenberg movement had been a rebellion. When the reading was finished, the emperor addressed the elector and the other Protestant princes to the effect that, seeing that their confession had now been refuted, it was their duty to restore peace to the Church and unity to the empire by returning to the Roman obedience. He demanded, in fine, consent to the articles now read, under pain of the ban of the empire. The Protestant princes were not a little surprised at the emperor's preemptions. They were told that they had been refuted, but unless they should be pleased to take the emperor's word for it, they had no proof or evidence that they had been so. Their understandings did not tell them so. The paper now read had assented to some of the articles of their confession. It had dissented from a good many others, but as to confuting even one of them, this, to the best of their judgment, it had not done. And as they knew of no power possessed by the emperor of changing bad logic into good, or of transforming folly into wisdom, the Protestant princes, a copy of the refutation having been denied them, intimated to Charles that they still stood by their confession. The design for which the Diet had been summoned was manifestly miscarrying. Every day the Protestants were displaying fresh courage, and every day their cause was acquiring moral strength. In the same proportion, the chagrin, anger, and perplexities of the Romanists increased. Every new movement landed them in deeper difficulties. For the emperor to fulminate threats, which those against whom they were directed openly defied, and which the man who uttered them dare not carry into execution, by no means tended to enhance the imperial dignity. The unhappy Charles, at his wit's end, he knew not how to hide his mortification and discomfiture. And to complete the embarrassment, an edict arrived from a consistory of cardinals held at Rome, 6th of July, 1530, disallowing and forbidding the ultimatum of the Protestants as opposed to the religion and prejudicial to the discipline and government of the Church. Before this, an event had taken place which helped to expedite the business. On the night of Saturday, the 6th of August, Philip of Hesse made his escape from Augsburg. Amid the cajoleries and threatening of the Diet, he was firm as a rock amid the waves, but he saw no purpose to be served by longer attendance at the assembly. Chafed by the continual delays, indignant at the dissimulations of the papists, tempted by the brilliant offers from the emperor, and assailed tomorrow by as terrible threats, moreover looked askance upon by the Lutheran princes, from his known leaning to Zwingli on the question of the Lord's Supper. Thoroughly wearied out from all these causes, he resolved on quitting the city. He asked leave of the emperor, but was refused it. Donning a disguise, he slipped out at the gate at dusk, and, attended by a few horsemen, rode away. Desirous of preventing this flight, the emperor gave orders overnight to have the gates watched, but before the guards had taken their posts, the Landgrave was gone, and was now many leagues distant from Augsburg. All was consternation at the court of the emperor when the flight of the Landgrave became known next morning. The Romanists saw him, in imagination, returning at the head of an army. They pictured to themselves the other Protestant princes making their escape and sounding the tocsin of war. All was alarm and terror and rage in the popish camp. The emperor was not yet prepared for hostilities. He shrank back from the extremity to which he had been forcing matters, and from that day his bearing was less haughty and his language less threatening to the Protestants. Luther, apart in his castle of Coburg, was full of courage and joy. He was kept informed of the progress of affairs at Augsburg and of the alternate fears and hopes that agitated his friends. Like the traveler in the Alps, who sees the clouds at his feet and hears the thunder rolling far beneath him, while around him is eternal sunshine, the reformer, his feet planted on the mountain of God's power, looked down upon the clouds that hung so heavily above his friends in Augsburg, and heard far beneath the mutterings of imperial wrath. But neither could the one darken the sunshine of his peace, nor the other shake his confidence in that throne to which, in faith and prayer, his eyes were continually uplifted. His letters at this time show a singular elevation of faith, and a corresponding assurance of victory. To take an instance, quote, "I beheld," says he, writing to his friends, "thick clouds hanging above us like a vast sea. I could neither perceive ground on which they reposed, nor cords by which they were suspended, and yet they did not fall upon us, but saluted us rapidly and passed away. Emperors and armies, and all the array of earthly power, what are they? Black vapors, which seem charged with tempest and destruction, but, just as they are about to burst, they are driven away by the breath of the Almighty, as clouds are driven before the wind." But fully to realize this, we must mount to Luther's elevation. We must stand where we have the cloud beneath, not above us. Meanwhile, in the Diet, promises had been tried and failed. Threats had been tried and failed. Negotiations were again open, and now the cause had nearly been wrecked. Luther lived above the cloud, but unhappily Melanchthon, who had to sustain the chief part in the negotiations, lived beneath it, and, not seeing the cords that held it up, and imagining that it was about to fall, was on the point of surrendering the whole cause to Rome. During the slow incubation of the Refutation, 13th of August, 7 men were chosen on each side to meet in conference and essay the work of conciliation. They made rapid progress up to a certain point, but the point they touched the essentials of either faith, they were conclusively stopped. The expedient of reducing the commission to 3 on each side was tried, in the hope that, with fewer members, there would be fewer differences. The chief on the Protestant side was Melanchthon, of whom Pallavicino says that he had a disposition not perverse, although perverted, and was by nature as desirous of peace as Luther was of contention. Well did Melanchthon merit this compliment from the pen of the Catholic historian. For the sake of peace, he all but sacrificed himself, his colleagues, and the work on which he had spent so many years of labor and prayer. His concessions to the Romanists in the commission were extraordinary indeed. He was willing to agree with them in matters of ceremony, rites, and feasts. In other and more important points, such as the Mass and justification by faith, findings were come to in which both sides acquiesced, being capable of a double interpretation. The Papists saw that they had only to bide their time to be able to put their own construction on these articles, when all would be right. As regarded the marriage of priests, communion in both kinds, and some similar matters, the Romanists agreed to allow these till the meeting of the next General Council. Touching the government of the Church, Melanchthon and his colleagues in the Commission were willing to submit the restored jurisdiction of the bishops and to acknowledge the Pope as head of the Church by human right. There was not much behind to surrender. A concord on this basis would have been the burial of the Reformation. Melanchthon, in fact, was building unconsciously a sepulchre in which to entomb it. The lay Christians in Augsburg felt as if they were witnessing its funeral. Consternation and grief took possession of the Swiss Protestants. They are preparing their return to Rome, said Zwingli. Luther was startled and confounded. He read the proposed concessions, took his pen, and wrote forthwith to Augsburg as follows: I learn that you have begun a marvelous work, namely to reconcile Luther and the Pope. But the Pope will not be reconciled, and Luther begs to be excused. And if, in despite of them, you succeed in this affair, then after your example, I will bring together Christ and Belial. This, one would think, should have torn the bandage from the eyes of Melanchthon, and revealed to him the abyss towards which he was advancing. He was not to be counseled even by Luther. His patience was fretted, his temper soured. He began to browbeat his colleagues, and was about to consummate his work of conciliation, as he termed it, but in reality of surrender, when deliverance came from another quarter. Smitten with madness in their turn, the Romanists drew back, when on the very point of grasping the victory. The matters in dispute between the two parties had been reduced to 3 points nominally, really to 1. Does man merit by good works? The Protestants maintained the negative, the Papists the affirmative, on this point. The first briefly sums up the Protestant theology. The last is the cornerstone of the Roman faith. Neither party would yield. So the conferences were broken off. Thus Rome lost the victory, which would in the end have fallen to her, had she made peace on the basis of Melanchthon's concessions. Her pride saved the German Reformation. It now remained only for the emperor to draw up the recess of the Diet. The edict was promulgated on the 22nd of September, and was to the following effect: that the Protestant princes should be allowed till the 15th of April next to reconcile themselves to the Pope and the rest of Christendom, and that meanwhile they should permit in their dominions no innovations in religion, no circulation of Protestant books, and no attempts at proselytism, and that they should assist the emperor in reducing the Anabaptists and Zwinglians. This edict Charles would have enforced at once with the sword, but the spirit displayed by the Protestant princes, the attitude assumed by the Turk, and the state of the emperor's relations with the other sovereigns of Europe put war out of his power. And the consequence was that the monarch, who 3 months before had made his entry into Augsburg with so much pomp, and in so high hopes of making all things and parties bend to his will, retired from it full of mortification and chagrin, disappointed in all his plans, and obliged to conceal his discomfiture under a show of moderation and leniency. Chapter 27. A Retrospect, 1517 through 1530, Progress. Glance back. The path continually progressive. The gains of 13 years. Provinces and cities evangelized in Germany. Day breaking in other countries. German Bible. German Church. A Saxon Paradise. Political movements. Their subordination to Protestantism. Wittenberg, the center of the drama. Charles V and his campaigns. Attempts to enforce the Edict of Worms. Their results. All these attempts work in the opposite direction. Onward march of Protestantism. Downward course of every opposing interest. Protestantism as distinguished from primitive Christianity. The two Bibles. Before the curtain rises on a due development of the great drama, let us pause and cast a glance back at the track over which we have passed. The few moments we may spend in this retrospect may amply repay us by disclosing more clearly, perhaps than we saw them while we were narrating them, the successive and ascending stages of the movement. It may well amaze us to think how short our journey has been, measured by the time it has occupied, yet how long it is, measured by the progress which has been made. It was but yesterday that the monk's hammer awakened the echoes of the streets of Wittenberg, and now it seems as if centuries had rolled away since that day, and brought with them the new world in which we find ourselves. On ordinary occasions, many years, it may be ages, must pass before an idea can establish for itself a universal dominion in the minds of men. Hardly has Luther uttered his great idea when, like the light, it breaks out on the right hand and on the left, and shines from one end of heaven even unto the other. How notable, too, the circumstance that our journey has been a continually progressive one. Steps backwards there have been none. The point reached today has ever been in advance of that arrived at on the day before. How wonderful is this when we think that no one had marked out the Church's path from her house of bondage to a land of liberty, and still more wonderful it is when we reflect that those who were the first to tread that path often found their wisdom at fault. Ever and anon their courage failed and their path faltered, and never were more than a few steps of their road visible at one time. All beyond lay hid in night, overhung by lowering clouds that seemed charged with thunder. But ever as the little Wittenberg band went forward, the cloud removed and stood further off. One unseen but mighty walked before them, and if at times the clouds returned, and the storm threatened to burst, they heard a sublime voice speak to them out of the darkness, saying, "When thou passest through the waters, I will be with thee, and through the rivers, they shall not overflow thee. When thou walkest through the fire, thou shalt not be burned, neither shall the flame kindle upon thee." Of these 13 fruitful years, between the 31st of October 1517, when Luther posted up his theses, and the 25th of June 1530, when the Augsburg Confession was read in presence of the emperor, how surprising the gains when we come to reckon them up. Electoral Saxony is reformed, and its sovereign is seen marching in the van of the reforming princes. Hesse is evangelized, and its magnanimous Landgrave has placed himself by the side of the Elector as his companion in arms in the great battle of Protestantism. In Franconia, Silesia, East Friesland, Prussia, Brunswick, Lüneburg, and Anhalt, the light is spreading. The gospel has been welcomed in the free towns of Nuremberg, Ulm, Augsburg, Strasbourg, Lübeck, Bremen, Hamburg, and many others, bringing with it a second morning to the arts, the commerce, and the liberties of these influential communities. Every day princes, counts, and free cities press forward to enroll themselves in the Protestant host and serve under the Protestant banner, and in many cases, where the ruler remains on the side of Rome, a not inconsiderable portion of his subjects have forsaken the old faith and embraced the Reformation. Wider still does the light spread. It breaks out on all sides. The skies of Bohemia, Moravia, and Hungary have brightened anew, and already in these countries have been laid the foundations of a powerful Protestant church, destined, alas, to sink all too soon under the gathering tempests of persecution. In Denmark and Sweden, the Reformation is marching on to its establishment. The Protestant standard has been planted on the shores of Zurich, and the neighboring cantons are rallying around it. The Alps brighten from one hour to another, and the radiance with which they glow is reflected on the plains of northern Italy. In France, at the court of Francis I, and in the Sorbonne, so jealous of its fame for orthodoxy, there are men who are not ashamed to confess that they have bowed to the authority of the gospel and consecrated their lives to its service. In England, the Lollard movement, which appeared to have gone to sleep with the ashes of its martyrs, is awakening from its slumber and girding itself for a second career more glorious than the first. In Scotland, the light of the new day is gladdening the eyes, and its breath stirring the souls of men. Luther's tracts and Tyndale's New Testament have entered that country. In 1528, the die is cast, and Scotland is secured for the Reformation. For now Patrick Hamilton is burned at the stake at St. Andrews, and his martyr pile becomes the funeral torch of the papacy in that country. So wide is the sphere which 13 short years have sufficed to fill with the light of Protestantism. Nor must we omit the note that in the midst of the German nation, like a pillar of light, now stands the German Bible. The eye that sees this light rejoices in it. The ear that hears this voice blesses it. In the presence of this divine teacher, human authority, which had so long held the understanding in chains, is overthrown, and the German people, escaping from the worst of all bondage, enter on possession of the first and highest of all liberty, the liberty of conscience. Further in Saxony and Hesse, there is now an organized church, the ground cleared of monasteries, convents, indulgence boxes, and other noxious growths of medievalism, begins to be covered with congregations and planted with schools. Pastors preach the gospel, for whom salaries have been provided, and an ecclesiastical board administers church discipline, and exercises a general supervision over the clergy. Protestantism, no longer a system of abstract doctrines, has now found an instrumentality through which to elevate the lives of men and reform the constitutions of society. Germany, from the wilderness it was a few years ago, is becoming a garden. Luther luxuriates over the rich verdure that begins to clothe Saxony. His pen has left us a fascinating description of it, and his words have all the warm coloring of the sacred idol, from which indeed his imagery would appear to be borrowed. I went down into the garden of nuts, to see the fruits of the valley, and to see whether the vine flourished, and the pomegranates budded. It gives me great and singular pleasure, says the Reformer, writing to the Elector, the 22nd of May, 1530, when I see that boys and girls can now understand and speak better concerning God and Christ than formerly could have been done by the colleges, monasteries, and schools of the papacy, or than they can do even yet. There is thus planted in your Highness's dominions a very pleasant paradise, to which there is none similar in the whole world. It is as if God should say, Most beloved Prince John, I commend these children to thee, as my most precious treasure. They are my celestial paradise of pleasant plants. Be thou a father to them. I place them under thy protection and rule, and honor thee by making thee the president and patron of this heavenly garden. Nor can we fail to mark, in fine, how entire and complete, all through this epoch, is the subordination of political events to the Protestant movement. If we take our stand at Wittenberg and cast our eyes over the wide field around us, attentively observing the movements, the plots, the combinations, and the battles that mark the progress of the great drama, our convictions become only the stronger the longer we gaze, that we are standing in the center of the field, and that this is the heart of the action. From any other point of view, all is confusion. From this, and from this alone, all is order. Events far and near on the Bosphorus and on the Tagus, in the land of the Moslem, and in the dominions of the Spaniard, find here their common point of convergence. Emperors and kings, dukes and princes, popes and bishops, all move around Luther, and all have been given into his hand to be used by him as the work may require. We see Charles waging great campaigns and fighting great battles. All this hard service is for Romanism. He believes, but Protestantism comes in and gathers the spoils. In truth, the emperor is about as helpful to the movement as the reformer himself, for never does he put his hand upon his sword hilt to strike at it, but straightway it bounds forward. His touch, so far from paralyzing it, communicates new life to it. Let us mark how all things work in the reverse order, and establish the very thing which the emperor wishes to overthrow. Of this Edict of Worms is a striking example. It was promulgated in the confident hope that it would effect the extinction of Protestantism. It becomes, on the contrary, one of the main means of establishing it. Each successive attempt to enforce that edict only resulted in lifting up Protestantism to a higher platform. The first effort made to execute it, in 1521, sent Luther to the Wartburg. No greater service could anyone have done the Reformation at that hour. The Reformers out of sight indeed, but only to do a most essential work. A few months elapse, and the German Bible is seen at the hearths of the German people. The second attempt to put this edict in force at the Diet of Nuremberg, 1522, evoked the 100 grievances of the German nation. This was a second great advance, inasmuch as it identified the Protestant movement with the cause of Germany's independence. The third attempt, at the Diet of Nuremberg 1524 to enforce the edict led to the virtual toleration of Protestantism. All that the princes could promise the emperor was that they would execute his decree against the reformer if possible. But they had previously declared that this was not possible. Thus, under the tutelage of Protestantism, a public opinion had been formed so powerful as to bring the imperial authority into a deadlock. The fourth attempt to execute the Edict of Worms, made at the Diet of Spires, 1526, led to another most important concession to the reformers. The virtual toleration of Protestantism by the previous Diet was now changed into a legal toleration, the princes agreeing by a majority of votes that, till a general council should assemble, the states should take order about religion as each might judge right. Yet another attempt, the fifth, to enforce the edict, was made at the Diet of Spires, 1529. This most of all was helpful to it, for it evoked the famous Protestant and Lutheran princes. Protestantism had now become the public creed of the princes, states, and churches of one half of Germany. It was idle longer to talk of the Edict of Worms. From this time forward, Protestantism could be suppressed only at the cost of civil war. Nevertheless, the emperor did make another attempt, the sixth, to execute the redoubtable edict, which so far had been formidable only to himself. Charles had just triumphed over the Holy League and sealed his new alliance with the Pope by the promise of turning the whole influence of his policy, and should that not suffice, the whole force of his arms, to the extermination of Protestantism. In order to fulfill that promise, he convokes the Diet of Augsburg, 1530, and goes there in person to make sure that this time his project shall not miscarry. It is now that he puts the topstone upon the fabric which he had hoped to raise. The Augsburg Confession, prepared in prospect of this assembly, and read before the emperor and the Diet, formed the culmination of the German Reformation. Protestantism in Germany was now in its zenith. It shone with a splendor it had never before, and has never since attained. Thus, at every new attempt to put the ban of the empire in motion, in order to crush Luther and extirpate Protestantism, it recoils on the throne of Charles himself. The sword unsheathed at Worms, 1521, instead of dealing the fatal stroke to the great movement which the man who drew it forth most firmly believed it would, becomes the instrument to open the Reformation's way through innumerable difficulties. It led it on step by step to its consummation and glory. Thank you all for taking your time to listen to the history of Protestantism. Please like this recording wherever it is that you are listening to it. And as a special favor, I ask you all to go to crosstheborder.org and click on the cover of the volume that you are listening to, which will take you to the appropriate Amazon page. And please leave a 5-star review there and a brief comment about something that you've heard or read in that volume. Thank you so much for taking that little bit of extra time to support us.